A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we are going to cover the concepts of migration infrastructure and migration industry. So, these are, we've looked at various theories of migration, and these are some concepts which are more recent and largely based on empirical work. So, these concepts have come from empirical work of Zhang and Lindquist related to migrant infrastructure. So, these are really new ways of seeing and thinking about migration. So, the concept of migrant infrastructure is actually coming from empirics. So, Zhang and Lindquist, in their own respective work on low-skill migration from China and Indonesia, they developed this concept, and so they argued that the current theoretical frameworks, the current conceptual frameworks are not adequate to understand many facets of migration, and migration infrastructure is one such component. And so what they do is, based on Zhang's work of labor migration from China and based on Lindquist's work on labor migration from Indonesia, they argue that they build this concept of migrant infrastructure, and I'll take you through it. Very interesting. And the second concept is that of migration industry. And the concept of migration industry is largely coming from a perspective where you have many actors in migration. And so then we'll talk a little bit about how the migration industry is not only facilitating migration, but also so involved in the regulation of migration, in migration management. And we also see an increasing role of non-state actors. So, we begin with migration infrastructure. Now, so Zhang and Lindquist argue that a puzzling development in many parts of Asia since the late 90s has been that international low-skill migration has become both easier and cumbersome. Now, this is a paradox, right? This is a paradox. And why is it easier? It's easier because more people have gained legal access to overseas job opportunities, and journeys are quicker, journeys are safer. So, therefore, international migration on the whole in many contexts in the global south has become easier. But it's also become more cumbersome. It's also become more complicated, since you have an increasing involvement of many actors and many non-migrant actors, and you have growing regulation, growing state regulations both in source regions and in destination regions, and all of this has also led to higher migration costs. Now, in China, for instance, until the early 2000s, only employees in the state-owned enterprises could work overseas legally, right? And now, whereas today, anybody who wishes to, who wants to go abroad and work, can do that. But what has happened is that there has been a massive rise in intermediaries, right? In agents, in contractors, in intermediaries, which has really pushed up the average cost of migration. So, most of low-skill migration from China within Asia goes to Japan, goes to Singapore, goes to South Korea, and in the 1990s, in the early 90s, the cost of migration was literally nothing. And bit by bit, the cost of migration has really gone up. And in their paper, Zhang and Lindquist argue that by 2010, migrants were spending as much as $8,000 to migrate abroad, right? Whereas the wages that they earn, their monthly wages, were stagnant at $500. So, similarly in Indonesia, wages have increased, but the fees of brokers, informal recruiters, specifically in female domestic work have increased tremendously. And so, therefore, recruitment companies, the whole network of agents have grown far more faster than actual migration. So, they use the example of Bruno Latour on flying, and as Bruno Latour says, flying is a property of the whole association of entities that includes airports and planes, launch pads and ticket counters. B-52s don't fly, the US Air Force flies. So then, so therefore they argue that it's inaccurate to claim that an airplane or a pilot flies, and then following this logic, it is not migrants who migrate, but rather constellations consisting of migrants and non-migrants, of human and non-human actors, and this is increasingly becoming more and more obvious today, more than ever before, because labor migration is very, very intensively mediated. And so therefore, this notion of migrant infrastructure or the notion of migration infrastructure is actually, it refers to the systematically interlinked technologies, institutions and actors that facilitate and condition mobility. And therefore, then it opens up such spaces of mediation to analysis, such spaces of labor mediation through which migration happens. Now, what Zhang and Lindqvist do is they disaggregate migrant infrastructure into 5 components, or they say there are 5 dimensions of migration infrastructure. So therefore, this is being done for analytical purposes. The first dimension is commercial, and this refers largely to the recruitment intermediaries that exist in migration. The second dimension is regulatory. So this refers to the state apparatus and the procedures for documentation, licensing, training and all such purposes. The third dimension is technological, and the technological dimension refers to transport, communication, and how we all know in the last few decades there has been tremendous progress in this dimension. The fourth dimension is humanitarian. This refers to NGOs and international organizations that are part of the whole migration infrastructure. These are also becoming increasingly relevant as we have wars going on, as the refugee population is increased and so on. And the last dimension of migrant infrastructure is social networks or migrant networks that they refer to, and you know we've studied migrant networks in another conceptual and theoretical concept in one of the previous classes. So now what they're saying is that these 5 dimensions that you see, they have their own distinct logics of operation, right? And they also intersect with one another. So for instance, you can see that the commercial infrastructure functions interact with regulatory, technological, humanitarian and social, right? But what you have is, in each dimension, the leading actor, the driving forces, the central strategies and rationalities and the modus operandi differs, right? And so what they're arguing is that these 5 dimensions collide with each other, they contradict one another, and this entanglement between the dimensions is a key to understanding migration infrastructure. Now, then there's a concept of infrastructural involution, and this concept is that they come up with, and this concept is derived from the idea of agricultural involution. Agricultural involution refers to when you have more and more inputs in agriculture, but your output doesn't increase proportionately. So what they argue is, in relation to low-skilled international migration, in the context of China and Indonesia, the empirics that they see, the empirics that they study and analyze, it's made them argue that this has led to a process of infrastructural involution. And what do they mean by infrastructural involution? Infrastructure involution is when migration itself becomes self-perpetuating and self-serving, and the intensification of migrant infrastructure does not really generate new capacities for migration. So what they're arguing is that the development of migration infrastructure has turned migration into an object of regulation, commodification, intervention, but all of this does not necessarily mean that migration has enhanced people's migratory capability. in terms of making independent decisions, exploring new paths, cultivating transnational social relations. So in other words, we studied migrant agency earlier and we looked at structure. And what they're really saying is that, hey, okay, so the migrant infrastructure is enabling migration to a fair degree and people are migrating, but it does not mean that it has necessarily enhanced their migratory capability. And we'll see through the examples of the case studies of migrants that they have used in the paper, we'll see that how it is that the infrastructure actually kind of contributes to taking away people's agency rather than contributing to people's agency. That we'll see in a bit, right? So what they're arguing is that the volume, the frequency of migration has really not increased in response to the amount of migration infrastructure that is increased. And it's in this process that they argue that there is a paradox. And the paradox of increasing levels of freedom on the one hand, that people are migrating and they can migrate, but it's also complications. The migration is not entirely autonomous and it sort of intersects with demands at destination, regulation and so on and so forth. So what you really have is the paradox of increasing levels of freedom and increasing complications related to migration. Now, why is it that there has been an intensification of labor mediation, that there has been an intensification of the infrastructural involution? For this, they take us to the political economy. So what they're arguing is that on the one hand, you have an increasing level of mobility, migration has increased due to the extension of market forces, right? We have a more open economy and labor is free to go to work. And on the other hand, simultaneously, you have state regulation, which has increased tremendously. So even though labor is free to go to work in other countries and so on, in response to the labor demand in those countries have tremendous regulations as to who can come, how can they come, what should be the processes of coming, and what should be the processes of going back. So you see, this is also circular migration. And so therefore, to respond to all of this, you have increasing state regulation, both in the source region and in the destination countries. So they argue that migration infrastructure is particularly evident in Asia, and these developments, the infrastructurization of migration has largely taken place in Asia, because even though both governments of sending and receiving countries are involved, so what they're arguing is that even though governments of both sending and receiving countries promote temporary labor migration, it's placed under increasingly sophisticated regulation. So what are these regulations? So in receiving countries, for instance, migration infrastructure specifically related to low-skilled migrants is confining migrants to employers, preventing settlement. They should not settle down. They cannot settle down in destination countries, and enforcing return. Whereas in Asia and Middle East, there is a tendency to concentrate on migration infrastructure on the sending side. So the receiving, so the sending state is very active in regulation. And they argue, they find both in the cases of China and in the case of Indonesia, that the migration infrastructure is less elaborate on the receiving side, but it relies on the sending side. So receiving states rely on sending states to achieve its goal, right? So whatever documentation that needs to be done, whatever certifications that need to be done, whatever skills that need to be developed. So receiving states actually rely on sending states to do all this. And so this then makes the case for countries like Indonesia, countries like China, and even many other countries like Nepal, Philippines, India. All of these then really, these cases become very important in understanding state regulation in international migration. So how does migration infrastructure really work? So let us go through the cases in the paper. So Zhang and Lindquist take us through the case of a male migrant, Sun Diajun, and the case of a female migrant, Putri. Now, so Sun Diajun is a 27-year-old man, and he eventually migrated to Singapore to work in a factory job. But let's talk about how he got there. So Sun approached Ol Chen. Ol Chen is a broker in the village, and Ol Chen is a retired government officer. So he's a government officer turned broker, and he's an informal broker. He does not have any foreign connection, any overseas connection or license or office, but he is what is known as a grassroots leg of a higher level intermediary, right? So then Sun decided to migrate. Sun had no idea where he wanted to go, but he decided that he has to migrate. So he went to Ol Chen. 4 months later, a factory job became available in Singapore through a Chinese labor recruitment company, right? And so this company is called Blue Sky. So once that job was available, Sun signed an agreement and paid the first installment of $1,000 US. Now, Blue Sky, after Sun made the payment, followed up with Sun directly or followed up with Sun through Chen to apply for a passport, to obtain a criminal clearance, authenticate education certificates and skill recognition by a notary, and also arrange a medical checkup. After all of this paperwork was done, the Singapore government approved a work permit. And so when the work permit was approved, Sun paid a fee of $5,000, which was an intermediary fee as well, and it included the airfare, and he paid a $3,300 security bond. Now, Sun's migration was financed by sale of assets. He sold the house he had inherited from his parents. He also sold his wife's food stall, and that's how this migration was financed. And at the time, after he arranged for these resources, that's when Sun realized that Blue Sky did not actually have direct access to Singapore employers, but Blue Sky relied on a company called World Journey. World Journey is a government state-owned enterprise, a Chinese government state-owned enterprise, and World Journey was among one of the 50 companies that jointly authorized by the Chinese and Singapore governments to recruit workers from China to Singapore. Now, companies like World Journey are called windows, right? And both informally as well as in official documents. And all legal international migration takes place through them. It must go through them. But companies like World Journey are unwilling to deal with individual migrants. So what do? So they rely with legs. They rely on legs like Ol Chen. And Sun was actually very pleased when he heard that this was the process, that there was a lengthy chain of intermediaries and that it all happened so quickly. So then Sun together with a group of migrants, then Sun was driven to the airport by Blue Sky's manager. And the manager then handed out passports, employment contracts and promise letters. And they also gave a whole list of prohibitory activities, things that migrants can't do at destination. And if, like they can't spit, they can't go on strike. If they did any of this, it could lead to the breaching of the contract and their security bond would go. So Sun, when was given the contracts, he immediately signed the contracts and letters, and there was no time to read them. And then he arrived in Singapore. Now, once he arrived in Singapore, the Singaporean labor recruitment company, Dragon and Horse, was there to receive them. And immediately they gave them purple shirts to wear, and then wearing those purple shirts, the airport staff recognized them and escorted them outside in Singapore to the driver who was waiting for them. Now, in Sun's case, his monthly salary was $500 US. Blue Star had promised him overtime, but once he went to the factory, he realized that there is no overtime work. Now, this meant that it would be impossible for him to recover his fee, and it would take as long as 3 years. So, 2 months later, Sun decided to return to China. He submitted his resignation letter, and Dragon and Horse moved him to its own housing. And his work permit was cancelled, a return ticket was arranged for him, and Sun had to pay for the return ticket himself since he had terminated his contract prematurely. And then he was flown back to China, and then now in all of this process, of the $6,000 that Sun had paid, Blue Sky kept $3,200 as service fee, and Old Chen kept $300, and World Journey kept $2,500. So you see, he only got back his security bond once he went back to China. So Sun's migration journey then was very expensive for him, and he had to incur great losses. On the other hand, we now look at the example of Putri. Putri is a female, she's in her mid-20s, she's divorced, and she has 2 small children to whom she's the primary caregiver. Now, in Putri's case, Putri is from Lombok, Indonesia, and in Putri's case also, just like Sun, she had to undergo several processes, several rules, and encounter several actors in her migration journey. So, in Putri's case, Putri had a neighbor, Sari, who was a migrant turned broker, and Sari introduced Putri to Pak Adi, who was a field agent. And so what's a field agent? So, field agent generally recruit prospective migrants and deliver them to licensed recruitment companies. So, the first intermediary that Putri encountered was after Sari, her neighbor, Pak Adi, the field agent. Now, Pak Adi was a low-level bureaucrat, well-respected, and he convinced Putri and her parents to go to Saudi Arabia to work. So, and this interaction was very important, because had Putri not met Pak Adi, had Putri not met Sari, she would really not have been convinced to migrate. So, once the parents were convinced and once Putri was convinced, then the whole process was set in motion. Putri was interviewed, registered, examined as a prospective migrant, and both Sari and Pak Adi helped her with the paperwork. So, she first went to Mataram, which is a private recruitment agency, where she was interviewed, medically examined, and she had to undergo a pregnancy test. All low-skilled domestic workers, female domestic workers going into the Middle East must undergo pregnancy tests. And then they had to go through various government offices for birth certificate, identity card, and then the Department of Manpower for the registration and for the special interview and for the special Indonesian migrant worker passport. Now, after this, when this was done, she had to fly to the state capital of Jakarta. And in Jakarta, she flew with 3 other women. She lived there for 3 months at a center of recruitment agency in Jakarta, where she learned Arabic, she learned how to cook culturally specific food, childcare, how to behave. They are taught how to behave with their employers. And then after these 3 months in Jakarta, she flew to Saudi Arabia. So then here she flew to Riyadh with 50 other people, just the way Sun had flown with 100 other people from Singapore to China. And through a local labor agency then, she was moved to her employer, which was a family with 3 children. So Putri then worked in Riyadh for 2 years, unlike Sun, who came back in 2 months. Putri worked there for 2 years. Her migration journey was a profitable journey for her. She was employed under the kafala system, where she worked with one employer. And when she came home after 2 years, she came home upon the completion of her contract with $3,000. Now, when Putri landed in Jakarta, she was diverted to a special migrant terminal designated for returning female low-skilled workers, There she was interviewed by the government officials. They took account of her migration experience. It was assessed by the IOM. So, the International Organization for Migration has a counter-trafficking unit at the Jakarta airport. And even though she was classified as a migrant without problems, she was not allowed to leave the terminal on her own and was compelled to purchase a special bus ticket back to her home village. So, both of these examples really show us, the very expensive forms of mediation and infrastructure. Both Sun and Putri were escorted and encapsulated from the beginning until the end of the migration circuit. So, this is a glimpse of how migration infrastructure really works, and Xiang and Lindqvist, through their fieldworks respectively in China and Indonesia, take us through these cases of Sun and Putri to show us how densely labor migration is intermediated and what all migration infrastructures are needed for the migration to actually happen. Right. So, using the example of China and Singapore, Xiang and Lindqvist show that low-skilled labor migration is more intensively mediated than before. So, they tell us that you shouldn't imagine migration as a line between two places, but rather it's a multifaceted space, and it's a multifaceted space of mediation which is occupied by commercial recruitment intermediaries. As we saw in the case of Sun and Putri, the commercial recruitment agencies, the commercial recruitment intermediaries can be large or small, they can be formal or informal, and then you have bureaucrats, NGOs, the migrants themselves, and technologies. They also argue that it's in this space that migration acquires particular forms and particular meanings, right? And then they propose the idea, the notion of migration infrastructure to unpack this space. So, therefore, they see migration infrastructure as an analytical perspective that we see earlier, that helps us reconceptualize what is already known, and also as a methodological tool that renders visible what was previously hidden. So, what they're really saying is that migrant infrastructure represents a new way of describing and analyzing migration in the face of changing empirics, in the face of changing empirical realities. And so then again emphasizing that labor migration is not what it used to be earlier. And there is a paradox. The paradox is that the migrants are enjoying safer journeys, the migrants have fewer injuries, but they also have to shoulder higher financial burdens, and they face, even though they face less physical risks, they are more socially constrained. So, therefore, what you have is very important, the very important point. What you have is that migration is determined neither by autonomous markets, policy logic, nor according to individual migrant agency, but rather it is constituted by a multitude of activities, practices, and technologies that must be considered in specific contexts. So, you see here now again, let's go back to our migration theories, right. So, you have the neoclassical theory saying migration because of disequilibrium, right, because markets are autonomous, and we see in both the cases of Putri and Sun, we didn't really sort of encounter that very much. Neither is there any policy logic, right. So, well, there is policy logic, and the policy logic is linked with the demand for labor in these capitalist societies. But like, I think over here what they mean is, when we did the case of methodological nationalism, right, in that sense, from the perspective of the nation state, there is, no policy logic. And this is a fundamental point about individual migrant agency. So, of course, migrants, these are autonomous labor movements. People are showing tremendous tenacity and will that they want to migrate, and therefore they are incurring all these costs and migrating in all of these faraway places. But like we saw earlier, the migration is socially constrained, right? And it is not migrant agency like the way we studied migrant agency theoretically. It is quite socially constrained. So therefore, what we really need to look at is we need to look at migration infrastructure. You know, the activities, practices, technologies that appear and emerge in specific contexts, and they offer us an analytical order to understand these activities. And Zhang and Lindquist say that we do understand these dimensions of migration infrastructure, but we don't give them any predefined categories. And then they tell us about infrastructure involution. They literally delineate infrastructure involution, the intensification of migration infrastructure in people's lives that does not expand their migratory capability, right? And they do this as an example of how the interplay between different aspects of migration infrastructure becomes a very central flow in, and then they take us through infrastructural involution, and which really is the intensification of migration infrastructure that does not expand people's migratory capabilities. And they do this as an example of how the interplay between different aspects of migration infrastructure becomes a central force in conditioning the migration flows. So then this really explains the phenomena that low-skill labor migration has become both more accessible and at the same time more complicated in the case of China and Indonesia. And these concepts are very relevant for other countries in the global south, you know, such as Nepal, India, the Philippines. We now come to the concept of migration industry, and this is largely drawing on Gammeltoft, Hansen and Nyberg Sorensen's work. And Gammeltoft, Hansen and Nyberg Sorensen take us through Hernandez-Leon's work. And Hernandez-Leon, in the context of migration from Mexico to the US, define the concept of migration industry. So Hernandez-Leon is actually arguing that migration industry is something which is the ensemble of entrepreneurs who, motivated by their pursuit of financial gain, provide a variety of facilities. So Hernandez-Leon conceptualized migration as the ensemble of entrepreneurs who, motivated by the pursuit of financial gain, provide a variety of services facilitating human mobility across international borders, right? So the migration industry therefore greases the engine of international migration. And so therefore the migration industry entrepreneurs include money lenders, recruiters, transportation providers and travel agents, legitimate and false paper pushers, smugglers, contractors, formal and informal remittance and courier service owners, lawyers, notaries offering legal and paralegal counseling, and promoters of immigrant destination. And we saw both in the case of Sun and Putri how all of these were also very much there, very much in the process of their migration journeys, right? So the other thing about the migration industry is that you have had a situation where the government has outsourced migration management to private contractors. That is something that comes out very clearly in the migration industry. So whether it's for the provision of immigration checks, whether it's to operate detention centers, whether it's to carry out post returns. So you have control providers, right? There are these agents, there are these entities that are providing control, and all of these roles have been outsourced by the government, right? And what you also see is that there are several non-state actors that are involved, and they have reasons other than financial gain to be involved. And these non-state actors are NGOs, social movements, faith-based organizations, and migrant networks. So therefore, you have, this is also then termed as the rescue industry by Laura Maria Augustin. So this idea, the whole idea that what is really unique about this concept of migration industry is that you have some parts which are facilitating mobility, right? Like we saw, migrant infrastructures were also there to facilitate mobility, and in doing so they work very closely with all kinds of actors. But there is also another part that is working very actively to manage migration, to constrain migration, right? And both of these are going on hand in hand. Just one more point I want to talk about the non-state actors, you know, and how Laura Maria Augustin has termed the rescue industry. This rescue industry includes information centers that focus on the risk of irregular migration, then philanthropy, social projects rescuing trafficked women, children, minors, religious sanctuary movements, and finally the increasing role of NGOs, for example, in running asylum centers. So the migration industry, just like migration infrastructure, is a relatively new concept to understand the various facets of migration which is going on empirically, both in terms of how it facilitates migration and constrains migration. So with that, we come to the end of this lecture. In this lecture, we looked at two very specific concepts of migration infrastructure and migration industry. For migration infrastructure, we largely followed Zhang and Lindquist's reading titled Migration Infrastructure, which was published in the International Migration Review in 2014. And for migration industry, we followed Gamfold, Hansen and Nyberg Sorensen's reading. It's a book actually, but the concept is largely coming from there, the migration industry and the commercialization of international migration. Thank you very much.